Hi there. Is Deanna going to be joining us, or did I imagine that?
Deanna is your tech moderator.
Oh, great. Hi. Thank you so much. Keep me from making a fool of myself, okay? Um, Thank you so much for having me here. I've really enjoyed getting to talk to people and talk about writing, and this is amazing. I'm very sorry that we're only virtual this year, but we can look forward to the coming years when we get to be in person. I want to first acknowledge I'm on Ohlone land in Oakland and happy to share that with all of you. I'm going to read primarily from the Gilda Stories in various incarnations. As I talked about earlier when we were on, the Gilda Stories I published in 1991. It was originally published by Firebrand Books, a lesbian feminist press, and it has been in print continuously for 30 years and was recently republished for the 25th anniversary edition by City Lights Books, which is a small press, independent press here in the Bay Area. I feel very fortunate that I've been published by independent presses because it's the only way the book would have stayed in print so long. It also stayed in print because of the advent of speculative fiction classes, which started happening sometime, I guess, maybe in the 2000s, when people started really paying attention to the rise in speculative fiction in the general population, reading of speculative fiction in the general population, and started to teach it both for the history of the literature as well as writing of speculative fiction. As you all probably know, the Gilda Stories won 2 Lambda Literary Awards when it was first published for fiction and for science fiction. And I adapted it for the stage for a company based in New York called Urban Bushwomen, and it toured 13 US cities to sold-out houses in the late 90s. So one of the first thing I want to read to you is from the play that I adapted from the novel. The play was called Bones and Ash, a Gilda Story. And I wrote a series of monologues. I adapted the play using just the first 2 chapters of the novel, and everything was broken up by monologues. And one of the struggles for my vampires, and I'm happy to talk about my shifting around of the mythology of vampires, trying to keep them from being just predators. But one of the first struggles that they had was understanding that their long life meant that they were leaving people behind all of the time. People they cared about, people they loved. They couldn't just turn everybody into a vampire. So this particular monologue is called Longevity. I wanted to be with her more than I wanted sunshine, more than the sanctity of church and kin. But she was too much here. It was not my years, but hers. She was unable to come backward to the past with me. For this, I hated her, hate her still, even though now she lives only in my memory. I lifted myself up from anger, from pies and doilies, from good church works. I lay open on a kitchen table slab, begging to be looked upon, shaping that moment in my head. But she spoke only of time, especially the present, its preciousness, as if I were a teenager unlikely to comprehend tomorrow. I own a wool cape, sewn late into the night. She grew fond of seeing me wear it. It is a dull, thick brown, but the clasp at the neck is finally done. The buttons hand covered, even the cloth cut by me. I have calluses on my fingers, this time from the bite of the scissor as I plowed through the bolts of wool to shape the fall of soft material around my hip. I cut too long under a lamp, too dim even for my eyes, dark fabric drawing them to pain. It was not for the present I cut this cloth, but for the night she'd finally notice the buttons as she had them undone. When wet, the wool smells like the inside of my thighs, puckering my own mouth in hunger. I am not sacred. The folds of my flesh are eternal, but ordinary, except when under a gaze, hers, my own. Her youth is an arrow piercing my skin, tearing through to the other side, exiting, leaving me alone. Motion swept her along to some other place. I remained behind. I envy her this leaving, this brief future she swallowed, loving me, deserting me to meet some other new day I could not attend. I always expected I might catch up, grow old enough to be with her. Instead, I am neither young nor old. Mine eyes have seen a glory. We were never meant to survive. I do not die. In her dewy face, I see cotton balls, bloodied. I am a woman lying alone on a table with a cloak. One line in that is from Audre Lorde. We were not meant to survive is from Audre Lorde's Litany for Survival poem. I don't know where I'm going to be able to see the questions, but I'm sure somebody will tell me. And I do have the chat open if people have questions. You can pop them in there if you don't know how to do the question thing across the bottom. We will have time for questions at the end. So for those of you who don't know the Gilda Stories, I mean, I've written many other pieces of speculative fiction and ghost stories. I'm most recently published in a speculative fiction anthology called No Police Equals No with a K, Police, and which is about speculative fiction stories written about what it would be like to have no police in our culture. How would we imagine that? And I've written some ghost stories and stories about. I have one great story about a woman getting a full body tattoo. So I've written a number of different things, but of course I'm most known for the Gilda Stories, and I am working on a sequel, which I'll read a little bit from after this. And the biggest thing about Gilda, for those of you who don't know it, is it's about a young woman who escapes from slavery, a Black woman who escapes from slavery in the South in the 1800s and is rescued by two women, lovers, who run bordello in New Orleans, and she grows up there. And finally, the girl becomes a vampire herself. And the novel itself is about her coming of age, learning what it means to have long life, where she has to leave people behind, learning who she should turn into a vampire and who she should not. It is a lesbian feminist tale. And one of the key things about it, because I did change a lot of the tropes, traditional tropes, is that vampires don't have to kill to take blood. They take what they need, and they leave something in exchange, something that's meant to hold people together, meant to help them advance in their world. This section I'm going to read from the original novel. This is the anniversary edition. And this section takes place in Missouri in 1921. And it's just captures Gilda as she is on her way back to her farm where she lives in Missouri at the time. And she is overcome by some, as we say, ne'er-do-wells. Gilda had already stepped back onto the road, intent on fulfilling the stirring inside her, when she saw two men on horseback approaching from the west. They were moving at a good pace, as if racing, but they slowed when they noticed her and pulled up short a few feet away. One swung down from the saddle immediately. He stood before her with an angry glare that quickly turned into a leer when he realized she was not a man. "This here's a nigger gal we got here. What you doing out on the road this hour?" Gilda didn't respond, but let herself breathe in the smell of the horses and sense their anxiety and dissatisfaction with their masters. There was an idle communication between them and her that went unnoticed by the riders. Gilda felt reassured by the horses' solid presence, their lack of malevolence, and their easy response to comforting messages she sent them. The other horseman dismounted, holding a glistening whip coiled at his hip. "Maybe we teach one more Negro a lesson tonight, hey, cook?" Gilda peered at the braided leather, dark with blood she could smell. She wondered who had been their most recent pupil. "Yeah, Zach, I think there's a lesson here for sure." Gilda did not move or speak. She stood as if frozen, but her mind fluttered with words that had been given her in the past. She was not afraid as she had been those nights long ago when she escaped from slavery. She tasted the acid of hatred inside her mouth and wanted to be full of it to teach the lesson these two needed to learn. "She must be mute, Zach. Don't seem to talk, do she?" The taller man moved close to Gilda and yanked her hair, pulling her face up toward his. The moonlight glistened on her dark skin. Before he could press his advantage, Gilda grabbed his wrist, the crack of bone audible in the night. She pulled his hand from her head and twisted it behind his back, raising it so high the pain cut his voice before he could scream. She gave a sharp twist and let go, only when she felt his muscles quaking with pain. He whipped around toward her again, and she smashed the side of his face with her fist. The snap of his neck broke through the night as his body crumpled into the ditch beside the road. His fellow rider backed away, reaching behind him for the reins of his horse, but his mount deliberately twisted out of his reach, and Gilda set upon him before he realized the position he was in. She caught his whip in her left hand and pulled him backward. He fell to the ground, then scurried off the road to the brush, with Gilda bounding behind him. She cracked the whip once over his head, then lay a stroke across his back. That she hit him with his own whip seemed to startle him more than the pain. At the second lash, he turned to face Gilda, his eyes filled with rage. He gasped when he saw the swirling amber of her eyes and the sinewy strength of her body, thinking that they'd been wrong, that it was a man. An Indian, he thought, confused by the moonlight and his own fear. She cracked the whip, this time across his chest, then his cheek, opening the flesh almost to the bone. Gilda threw the whip down and leapt upon him, twisting his head to expose the pulsing vein in his neck. He was already faint with shock, yet Gilda sensed his disbelieving terror build. She scraped his flesh roughly with her nails and watched the blood pulse from his neck, searching for what he felt when he lay open the flesh of men. Her chest swelled with anticipation as she understood the terrible joy he experienced at demanding terror and death. She drew his blood into her quickly, then let him slip to the ground. She watched the blood continue to stream from his neck, soaking into the muddy ditch. She could feel life ebbing from him and was shocked at the excitement it roused. One death was enough. It had been so long since she'd been caught unawares like this. She knelt beside him, holding her hands to the wound on his neck and cheek until the bleeding stopped. She left him nothing in exchange except a simple recollection of falling instead of the horror of the real memory. His breath was shallow, but he was no longer in danger. Gilda was sickened by her anger and the thrill the confrontation had given her. She turned back toward her farm. Instead of her usual swift pace, Gilda took each step with deliberation. She was leaden with exhaustion. Anger had flared and burned out, leaving the taste of ashes. One death, she was grateful it had not been two. That is from the Gilda Stories. That takes place in Rosebud, Missouri in 1921. The novel itself starts in 1850 and goes to about 2050, I think. It catches all of the different people that she engages with over that 200 years of coming of age. I want to read maybe, I don't know, I'm not quite sure how much time we have, but I want...
have plenty of time because we have this whole hour and more.
Okay.
Also, if you can see the little Q&A bar at your bottom menu, and it has a little red dot next to it, you have questions there that you can answer if you, and you can do that now or later. Do you see the bar?
No, I don't see the bar. I see the chat thing, where I click on to see the chat. I do not see a Q&A bar.
Well, it's just one of the buttons on the bottom bar.
Okay, is that going to be like where the participants are? Or
yeah, so next to participants, chat, it might be under more if there's that menu. It depends on how compact your menu is.
It seems like it's really too compact. There's some dots here.
Okay, click
Uh,
the dots.
I cannot see, I see that the participants are there.
I can also read you your questions if you like.
Would you? Because I can't see them, and I'm happy to answer some questions right now before I go on.
All right, so there is a question from Scott that says, your writing is so evocative and sexually charged. Was it scary to put that out there when you first published the Gilda Stories?
Oh, interesting question. Yes. It is, I realized I tend to write a kind of a sensual quality. Some people say it's cinematic, but there is a sensual quality to the writing. I didn't even really think about it as I was writing it. And I think, my work growing out of the lesbian feminist movement, we were making an effort to feel the physicality uh, of ourselves and people around us. So I think that's why the work is so sensual. I did have people tell me after the book came out that they expected there to be more sex in the book. And I hadn't thought about actually having more sex in it, but I'm addressing that in newer Gilda stories. In my short story collection, Don't Explain, I have a Gilda story that actually has some sex in it. And the sequel will have actual sex in it. But sensuality was a big part of it, and it just seemed natural, so I didn't worry about it.
Cool. Here's another one from Olivia. Gilda is all about found family. Could you talk more about family and a definition of family beyond constrictive heteronormative definition of family and how you use that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As Armistead Mopal said, he describes things as biological family and logical family. And that to me says it all. You have people, family you're born into biologically, and sometimes they suit you and sometimes they do not. And one needn't feel any guilt when you have to move away from them if they are not healthy for you. But along the way, most people, because we are social beings, will pick up a logical family. That is, people who mean a lot to you, that you feel faithful to, that you feel trust you and are faithful to you. And I think it's important to cultivate that, not not feel like, oh, she's my friend today, but I've moved on, like we do in high school. But to think about the people that you care about at certain ages in your life, and as you get older, you make decisions. Do you still care about them? If they are people you would not necessarily have chosen to be friends with today, but you are friends with them because of your youth, how do you maintain a friendship with them? How do you see what you still have in common and share those things? That has been really important to me, certainly as I've gotten older. My best friend, first lover from high school, even though she is heterosexual, she's still a close friend, and I talk to her periodically. She came to my wedding to Diane, and other friends I've had for more than 30 or 40 years. And even, it's hard when you're moving around, like we move around geographically a lot, or at least we did before COVID. But I think you have to make a conscious choice. These are the people that I care about and will continue to care about. And these are the people, if they get in trouble, they will call me and say, can you help me? Whether it's, can I come over and stay with you because I'm in a breakup? Or can I borrow $100 from you? Or can I just talk to you about what's going on with me? Can you help me think about this new job? Can you help me figure out what to do with my kids? I mean, that's what family does for each other. And you make a commitment to it, whoever they are.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that in terms of found family and just people in my life that I relate to more than my biological family.
Mm-hmm.
Is your logical family, or a lot of them, also vampire lovers? And what is it that drew you to vampires?
Well, I guess they are vampire lovers because they love me and they read my work. What is it that drew me to vampires? It was a very kind of a spontaneous thing. I always read vampire fiction when I was in college and after. I loved um, the sensuality of Dracula and that seductive quality, even though he was a serial killer and was always seducing and killing women. There was that seductive quality I enjoyed. So I one day, and I in the new version of the book, the anniversary edition, I talk about this, and it actually happened. I was on the street. I was must have not paid my phone bill because my phone was turned off, and I went down to the corner to use the phone booth, which we used to have. And I was calling a friend of mine, and these two guys walked up to me, and they were kind of drunk, I think, and they were starting to, razz me about, oh, baby, let me suck your, whatever they had in their minds, and they were going on and on. And I was furious. I'm standing on the phone, I'm talking to my friend, and they're harassing me as if I was going to hang up and go with them. I went ballistic. I said to my friend, I'll be right back. I put the phone, was hanging down. I started screaming at them like a wild banshee. And they got so freaked out. One of the guys grabbed the other guy and said, man, this bitch is crazy. And he pulled the other guy away. And I was so relieved there was nothing at hand. There was no garbage can right there, because I would have picked it up and smashed them. I was so furious. And, this is what women go through all the time. Even if the men don't speak up, when we walk in the street, we know there's some guy who's thinking, oh, I could do whatever I want to her. And it's a subliminal anxiety that women live with all of the time. But they caught me on the wrong day. So I hung up on my friend. I said, I gotta go. And I hung up and I went home, and adrenaline was coursing through my body. So I started to write down what happened. And in the story that I wrote, the woman kills this person who has assaulted her or harassed her, picks up his body and throws it in the Hudson River, which was, like a block away, because I lived, like a block from the Hudson River. And I realized, oh, this was an interesting story. And so I went back the next day after, I had calmed down, and rewrote the story, making her a vampire, because that was the way that I could, I wanted to account for her superior strength. So I had her take his blood and then throw him in the Hudson River. And I talked with friends about it, and I read it at a couple of venues in New York when I lived in New York, and people loved the idea of this character who had such power. And that was the beginning of the Gilda Stories. And that was before I made the decision to not have her be a serial killer. So that was how it began, and I started writing more each section whenever I came across something that engaged me thinking. And then I decided, well, I'm going to make this be a collection of stories, and I would pick a period, like that first piece I read in Rosebud, Missouri in 1921. I would pick a period and do some research about the history of that period, what was going on there at the time, and kind of build a story around it. So that's how I came to the vampires.
Cool. Well, we do have the whole hour, so I want to let you read your next selection, and then I can come back with more questions.
Okay, great. This is also later in the novel, and it's from the chapter called Land of Enchantment in 2050. And I'm going to try to read, try to edit as I'm reading so I don't read too long. And in this story, the US and most people are suffering from inadequate, what is that word? Their health is all broken down. Their lungs are not strong. They don't have immune systems. That's what the story is. And they've wrecked their ecological systems and their air and all of that. So there's very short terms of life. People are not living past 50 or 60 anymore because of the way we have ruined the environment. And one of the things that happens is very wealthy people decide to hire people to capture vampires and then get blood transfusions so that they could get live longer. And this is a story about how Gilda got her first guard, I think. Let me see. I'm going to make sure I'm reading the right section. Right, she's going. No, that's not the right one. Let me read this. Okay. So this is in the future, Land of Enchantment, 2050. Gilda, before she turned down the boulevard that led to the edge of town, she felt a presence behind her. She slowed her pace and listened. Light reflected from a shop window, casting a dull glow, but most of the street was dark. It was the unmistakable stealth of a hunter. The reflex stimulants they used, making them faster and stronger than the weakened population, was evidence in the very silence of his steps. He kept pace with Gilda, but held his distance, hoping she assumed, to track her to her sleeping place, then overcome her. Gilda turned into a narrow alley of smaller buildings and low stoops, ran for the few steps, then backed into a doorway and threw an empty trash can down the alley. It clanged in echoes through the street for just long enough. The hunter came around the corner running. Gilda reached out and grabbed him by the throat, cutting off his wind and voice. He made a small choking sound but couldn't move, or Gilda's fingers would have ripped out his vocal cords. He swung his hand up in a swift chop to dislodge her grip. His strength was considerable, but Gilda's was greater. She pushed him away before he could strike her again. He hit the opposite wall and bounced forward like a toy. In the darkness, it was impossible to tell anything about the hunter, except that he was of narrow build, wiry and vicious. As he crouched low to use the ancient martial arts, Gilda spoke in a soft voice. Leave me. I have no wish to kill you. There was no visible reaction to her words as he continued toward her. Gilda turned to run, certain she could disappear before he had a hint of her direction. He grabbed her arm as swiftly as one of her own kind. His grip and the counter force stretched her arm away from its socket. The pain shot from her shoulder to the back of her head. Her mouth opened, but only breath escaped. Her foot rose smoothly, the toe of her boot catching the edge of his chin in a ballet movement marred only by the blood that arced from his nose as his head snapped backward. For a moment, there was a look of terror in his eyes. The mythology of the vampire still had power, even for the hunters. This one already regretted not waiting until she slept before he'd attacked. Even with biphetamines, he was not fast or strong enough for her, and the smell of blood was in the air. Gilda hit him full in the face with her left fist, feeling the slippery wound of his flesh. He lurched backward but didn't fall. He struggled forward again, and Gilda peered through the sheet of blood over his broken face into his clouded eyes. She held his gaze long enough to rip away his memory, then knocked him unconscious with a brick crack of her palm. He sat in the coldness of the pavement like a child, oblivious to the pain that tore through his body. Gilda left him there and sped away. Once back to the entrance of the cavern where she made her bed, she stood for a moment and sniffed the dry air. It was clearer than usual. Such a close call with the hunter was unnerving. She ignored the pain in her shoulder, certain that it would dissipate by tomorrow's nightfall, and tried to focus on the nighttime sky and her next move. Then her body became rigid as a message entered her thoughts. Her family was calling to her, telling her which direction she can move. The night shook with Gilda's laughter for the first time in years, happiness at hearing from them. Houston, who was her guard, joined in because it felt good to laugh freely in the night. He'd been waiting for her by her bedside. I'm sorry, Houston, you startled me. I thought you were fainting. We don't faint. And his name is actually Houston. He has described it earlier. It's written as Houston, but he calls himself Houston. We don't faint, Houston. All women faint, he said, chuckling. No, Houston, all women do not faint. They haven't in some time. Houston looked chagrined until he saw that Gilda still smiled as she gazed at the faint glow of the moon. So that is 2050 when Gilda is trying to figure out which direction to go to. She's hiding in a cave where Houston has been her guardian, watching over her while she sleeps, making sure that the hunters do not intrude upon her. And in the future, the chapters that take place in the future here really try to make use of increased technology, which makes it harder for vampires to stay off of everyone's radar. In the last chapter in the book, Gilda has, taken to, in the chapter before this, actually, the penultimate chapter, Gilda has taken to the coastline and the mountains to get away from technology, and all she does is email people that she knows and live under an assumed name because technology makes it really hard to be hidden of course. Um, and I have one more thing to read. I don't know if I should read it now or take more questions. What do you think, Valerie?
Would you like to take another question?
Okay, great.
All right. Did the setting much? Okay, setting something about setting. Setting your work historically, did it give you more freedom to explore your character's sexuality in a way that might have been more difficult if set in the present day or when you released it?
Well, I don't think I considered that as much. Um, I wanted to be able to have a character who existed through time, starting from her escape from slavery in the 1800s. But what I found in writing was, of course, lesbians have existed forever. Writing in the 1800s, there were different ways that women would uh, live, not openly as lesbians, but live in kinship as lesbians. And so that made it a little bit easier. The two women who rescue um, her as a child, as a girl, are lovers. And there's obviously gossip about these two women, one of whom is South American and one of whom is Native American. There's gossip about them, but of course, they have really independent lives. And because they have a bordello, they hold a lot of information about important people in town, so they feel safer. Um, when the By the time Gilda is of age and out on her own, I have her go to Yerba Buena, which is what San Francisco was called. And there she comes of age and has her first love affair. And there was something about it being in the Wild West, where anything goes, really, that made it feel more possible that we could see Gilda as a sexual being. Yes, that was helpful. And as I said, I'm writing a sequel to Gilda. That's actually, it's not really a sequel. I'm I'm calling it an interquel, because each of the chapters in the new book take place between the chapters in the original book. And they're meant to be more about, they're more dark, they're more about the inner emotional life that Gilda has as she is coming of age, really. So,
Do you have a timeline for when we get to see the interquel?
Well, I'm going to go back to work on it. I have about 5 chapters. I think they're going to be 10. I'm finishing a play right now, and once I'm done with that, which will probably be in May, not that the theaters are opening that quickly, I will go back to Gilda and really get busy with it. I doubt that it will see life in print much before a year, probably a little bit more. I think people know that Cheryl Dunye, who was one of the directors on the TV Lovecraft Country. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's extraordinarily exciting to see people of color, and it takes place mostly in the 50s and features these interesting monsters and characters and this, secret society, and it's really brilliant. And Cheryl Dunye, who's a Black lesbian director, she directed several of the episodes. She purchased the rights to the Gilda Stories, and she wants to make it a TV miniseries. I don't know how long it's going to be, but she's trying to pull that together right now. And so I'm very excited about that. And once she starts to work on that, I'll be trying to help out with that. And, I recommend Lovecraft Country. I mean, Watchmen and Lovecraft Country featured more African Americans in speculative fiction on TV than I have seen in my lifetime. And really some brilliant work. So
Have you ever done a TV screenplay, or are you interested in doing the screenplay aspect?
I have never done a screenplay. I don't know that I'm that interested. I mean, I love playwriting, which is really different. It's a really different kind of writing, screenplay writing. Yeah. And I think people who are more visually oriented would have a better chance. And figuring out what to leave out is very difficult. When I wrote the play based on the Gilda Stories, it occurred to me very quickly that I could only write the play based on 2 chapters, or the play would be 17 hours long. So, and that was a great experience doing that. But a screenplay is really, really different. You have to have an eye for what are the visual cues that move the story along. And there's much less dialogue. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's also just so different from a stage play because you're not thinking in terms of sets, like stationary sets. You can cut scenes so much more quickly.
Yeah, I'm very excited. I mean, I've watched a Lovecraft Country a couple of times, particularly the episodes that Cheryl Dunye has directed, to really get an understanding of how, horror is such a very specific kind of thing. And you want characters to be developed, and the visuals have to be engaging. And Lovecraft Country, for those of you who haven't seen it, is about this family who writes these books. For those of you who saw the Green Book, which is a real thing that was created so that African Americans knew where it was safe to stop and sleep and stop and eat. And the books were written by African Americans who went out and researched. And people, if they were traveling anywhere, they needed to know because it was not legal for people to stop everywhere. And so this Lovecraft Country is about a family that does this. And the troubles that they get into with the secret society and aliens from Vietnam. I mean, it's a very astounding. And it gave me it kind of convinced me, no, I don't want to write the screenplay. Too complicated. So I find it really fascinating that people can write in that genre. So, but not me.
All right, I have some more questions, and we do have the option to flow into the next hour. So would you like to read again, or would you like to answer some more questions?
I'd love to answer some more questions. I mean, I can always, read, but if people are here and have questions, I'd love to answer them.
Okay. All right, the phrase radical ecology is used in descriptions of your work. Can you tell us what that means to you and how your views on radical ecology may have changed over the past 30 years, or if they have?
I've only recently heard that word and that phrase. And for me, it's a really wonderful term because it implies action. If we believe that this planet is worth living on and worth saving for future generations, it means we have to act to do something about that. And in creating the Gilda Stories, I had that ideal in my head all of the time. I mean, when the end of the Gilda Stories, where the ecology has broken down so badly, I began to write that with an understanding that if we as people didn't do anything, this is what would happen. When I wrote that chapter, when I started that chapter, AIDS had not burst out in this country. The AIDS pandemic was not in people's consciousness, but I understood that if we continued on the road we were on, the immunological systems that human beings have would not be able to stand up to the things that are going on, whether it was the HIV virus or, as today, the coronavirus. And I think a lot of that comes from what we have done to our planet, and how we want to remedy that is really serious. We cannot leave it to anybody else. So I think radical ecology is what we need to do and think about, and it must infiltrate everything we do, from the kind of takeaway cups we use when we go for our coffee, to what kind of power we use in our homes, because it's, it's in our hands, really. And I try to have Gilda be totally conscious of that as I'm writing.
This one is about writing plays versus writing novels, because in a novel it's a very solitary thing and the whole scene is in your head, but with a play you get to leave gaps that the actors then get to fill in, or they can breathe life into it in a different way. So have you ever, or do you recall a time when an actor brought something to your script that just took your breath away, or is that something that you look forward to, or how do you imagine that in your head as you're writing stage plays?
When I'm writing a play, I'm very specific about what I imagine is going to be, how things are going to be said in the space. To me, writing plays is a bit like writing poetry. It's those gaps that are open for the energy of interpretation. I have absolutely seen actors read lines that I have written in ways that just made me gasp. Because of course, the genius of actors is their not just following direction, but their internalization of the character and how they interpret it. And my hope is I can be both specific with what I want, but also leave enough space for people to interpret. I've been doing a trilogy of plays. I'm working on the final piece in the trilogy. The first one was about James Baldwin, and in it, his character in his novel Giovanni's Room comes to life, and he kind of Baldwin wrestles with, should he publish that book or not publish that book, because it's of its open homosexuality and the class stuff that's very deep in it. So I have the character Giovanni be part of the dialogue. In the second play, which is about the singer-songwriter Alberta Hunter, who was a performer well into her 80s before she passed away. And she started in the 1920s, and she wrote Bessie Smith's first big hit. In that, and she also was a lesbian, and in that play, a person from her past who's now dead comes back to her as a ghost to show her through her past so she can understand where she is, where she's gone wrong, why she and her lover broke up, and why it's important that she step out on the stage when she's in her 80s. So again, I have a ghost character in there. I feel like my playwriting has incorporated my interest in the supernatural. That's why there are characters like that in the plays, because they give us another dimension to think about what's going on with the characters. And the third play, which I'm working on now, features a ghost you never see, who's a Wampanoag Indian who lives in the attic of this house where the retired vaudeville performers live. But they are always in conversation with her. So in that way, you just never know what people are going to do when they come up against these kinds of ghostly, quote unquote, characters. And yes, I have heard people say and do things in response that, I mean, that's the reason you write plays, because you want people to interpret them themselves. And I find that so fascinating. When a play of mine is running, I go every night. Absolutely every night. Just because every night is different.
Do you do mostly large stages, or are your plays done in community theaters? Do you know?
Right now, I have been for the last 10 years playwright in residence at New Conservatory Theater, which is in San Francisco. And it's an independent theater, you know, it's a LGBT theater. My plays have always been in the large stage, which for us is like, it seats 120 people. So it's not like I'm being done by, you know, some Broadway producers. I'm being done mostly by independent theaters. In New York, my last two plays, and I'm hoping the third, are done by a company called The Other Side of Silence, or Tassos, and they have been produced at an off-Broadway stage in Lower Manhattan called The Flea, which was co-founded by Sigourney Weaver, among other people. So I feel that's been really lucky for me, in part because Sigourney Weaver's film Alien was one of my big, I mean, it's still one of my big favorites. I came out to my mother and my grandmother in the bathroom after seeing Alien. So I've always felt a kinship with Sigourney Weaver, and that she co-founded this theater, and that my plays have appeared in it makes me feel like I'm practically coming home.
Have you ever met her or gotten her autograph?
No, I never have. I still have that as one of my hopes. You know,
just say, I'm in your theater, please come see me.
Please come see me. Right. I know. It's like every time I went to New York the last when the two shows were there, and I went to the show every night, and I kept looking around seeing. I should have asked them, does she ever come back? Someday.
Or maybe when you go full Hollywood with Gilda Stories, maybe.
Yeah, maybe I'll thank her in it, or give her a part.
Yeah, I mean, she could totally be killed by a vampire. She'd do very well.
Or she could be a friend of a vampire. She could be Gilda's friend.
There you go.
Not die, you know.
This is one about just the evolution of queer. How has the queer genre changed between the initial publishing of the Gilda Stories and the re-release 25 years later?
Oh, wow. Well, I will tell you, when I first started doing the Gilda Stories, I got a lot of negative feedback because people were concerned about me writing a story that connected a vampire with people of color and with lesbians. So I was surprised. I mean, I was reading the stories in uh, venues that were created for lesbians and lesbians of color, and I always got great feedback in the readings. But some political people felt like, no, this is not a good idea. And, you know, of course, in the late 80s, early 90s, there were many fewer people of color reading speculative fiction. And I had people tell me, um, you know, Black people have had enough horrific things happen to us. We do not need to read horror to uh, to be entertained. And I never could quite understand that because for me, speculative fiction and horror fiction are a way to imagine the world being different. That's you know, one of the things I talked about in my keynote about surrealism, indicating that in order to change the world, you first change your dreams. And for me, writing speculative fiction or horror or science fiction is a way that I change my dreams. Um, so since then, of course, you know, and the people who I was inspired by, first Joanna Russ, who was an out lesbian speculative fiction writer whose work is still exquisite. Um, then, you know, Octavia Butler, of course, was where I learned, okay, well, people of color can come alive in this genre. But since then, the world has been filled with words from queer speculative fiction writers. You know, we always had Samuel Delany, but now there's so many others, and I don't know how we account for that, except that there has been a number of presses that came into being. You know, Angel Martinez talked about it earlier about her press and Black Lesbian Feminist Press, presses that have focused and published speculative fiction writers, queer speculative fiction writers. Also, the other thing I would say as part of the reason is that lots of institutions of higher learning started doing speculative fiction classes, which, you know, in the early 90s, you wouldn't have been able to imagine that. I mean, in the 80s, I taught one of the first lesbian classes at Hunter College in New York. And that was the first lesbian class, and that was in the mid 80s. So the outbreak of speculative fiction classes has been amazing. And that, I think, has encouraged people to publish work because people who do these classes are always looking for work. I'm assuming that's one of the reasons that the Gilda Stories has stayed in print so long, is because it was the first and the only, at the time, Black lesbian vampire novel, and teachers used it because it was the only thing to use. And now I would say there's certainly a whole lot more African American and people of color vampire and speculative fiction writing, and some more lesbian of color. But I would say it's been fed by instructors, professors who want to teach the history of the literature and the writing of the literature. I mean, I went to, I think it was Bates College. I was up there for an entire week speaking in different classes that were about speculative fiction and feminism for a whole week, just talking about the Gilda Stories. So may that continue to happen, and that the literature, speculative fiction, continues to be recognized for the power that those words can bring, that the genre can bring to the culture.
Yeah, I definitely think it helps when teachers can focus on the evolution of where genre fiction has gone or where fiction has gone in general, because sometimes you get into a school situation where they're so focused on the classics that you never leave a certain, it's like, okay, so can we leave the 1920s? Because that wasn't great for everybody.
Right. Exactly. And I think it's very ironic to me that Lovecraft Country is such a wonderful story about these African Americans who start, creating these whole travel books and their involvement and heroics around these monsters, when H.P. Lovecraft was such a pig. He was such he was a racist, he was a xenophobe, he was so not about people of color and women that I think it's ironic. And the novel, it's based on the novel Lovecraft Country. I think it's great that they took that title because the book and the TV show really show us who people of color could be in this culture, in these heroic and amazing ways.
Yeah. So this is a question about your writing method. What is your writing method? Are you a plotter or a pantser? Do you have a writer's cave at home, or are you more of I like to be in a busy coffee shop person? And what is your preferred method of writing?
Okay. I have a writer's room. As you can see behind me, this is my office. It's not a fake screen thing. Those are my books and all my tchotchkes around me. I can write anywhere. If you set me down somewhere and there was a whole lot swirling around, I could write. I prefer to write in my office. I like to have my little things, my little, I don't know, the things where I keep my paper clips and my pictures of my family around me. I got my great grandmother and my partner and my cousins and my best friends. I love having them around me. People's gifts that they've given me. I've got so many different kinds of bats, you wouldn't believe it, that people have given me. I love being among those things in my books when I'm writing, because sometimes you think of something and you need it, and it's right in a book right behind me. My methodology. I'm not a plotter. I usually, particularly with Gilda, this is how I write Gilda. I come up with a location, a geographic location. If you notice the Gilda Stories, they all have Louisiana 1850. Then we go to Yerba Buena 1890. And then Rosebud, Missouri, 1921, and the South End of Boston, 1955. So I pick a place. In some cases, I just looked on a map. Like I think in this book, where is it? I think it's this one. Maybe it's in the new one that I'm working on, the sequel. Oh, no, it's in this book. I wanted to include the word rosebud, which is the final word in Citizen Kane, because I used to be a big Citizen Kane fan. So I looked on a map. I found a place that was called Rosebud in Missouri. I looked up the history of Missouri and the area. saw the Mississippi River flow nearby, and decided Gilda was going to be there after World War I, after African Americans had migrated up there, and then were going to be displaced by returning soldiers. So that was how I picked that particular plot, and that Gilda goes there and settles down and falls in love with the widow, but leaves her behind, because the widow is really needed to help the returning soldiers and the other African Americans who are being displaced by white soldiers who are coming back and wanting to come back to their jobs and farms. So I pick a place, and then I pick a plot to go with the place. That's how I do Gilda, and each chapter is set up that way. I don't usually plot it out. I start the story with my idea of what's supposed to happen. Sometimes I have to change it and adjust it, but usually it unfolds based on Gilda's needs. Gilda has to find blood, make friends, and move on. Those are the things that she has to do in each chapter so that she's not discovered as someone who never ages. She can't stay in one place for long. So.
And I have another one from Scott. He says, I also write some science fiction with epic time frames. What did telling a story over 200 years allow you to do in terms of character?
Well, I'm going to find that out more clearly as I write this sequel, because it's going to play out over the 200 years. Because I wrote each chapter individually, I wasn't thinking initially what happens over time. It was only when I went back to edit it so that Nancy Bariano at Firebrand Books could publish it as a novel, not just a bunch of stories, that I had to think about who she could be. So it was a coming of age story, and I thought about who she was at the beginning, which is a frightened girl escaping from slavery, being tracked by slave catchers, and then adopted into this interesting family that she comes to learn is vampires. And still at the end of the story, when she agrees to be a vampire, she still doesn't know what it means. And then in the next chapter, I figured out, well, she's got to learn something about being a vampire, having this long life, having her powers. And so I made the next chapter more of her learning about who she's meant to be. By the time I got to the third chapter, she needed to learn the limitations of her power. So in the third chapter, in Rosebud, Missouri in 1921, when she does fall in love with this woman, she has to learn why she can't turn everybody that she cares about into a vampire. And there's a perfect opportunity there for her. So as it progressed, I found Gilda became more complicated, more complex, more invested in mortals. In later chapters, she becomes a friend with a group of lesbians. In another chapter, she becomes involved with the theater company because she needs that input of energy, and their lives become important to her. And each time she's meant to learn how she's supposed to live. So I had it easy because I was writing the chapters piece by piece. In the new book, the chapters are taking place interspersed with the current chapters, and I'm delving a little bit more into Gilda's internal life, and some of the things that she faces that are difficult. So while in one chapter it seemed like, oh, she just overcame that and moved on, in the piece I'm writing, it'll be the next chapter, and it'll really tell you a little bit more emotionally. And I'm hoping that through the series of the new book, we learn more about her emotional interior life. And since I am writing this of a piece at one time, I have a better idea of how to think about it, where I want her to end up. With the original book, I did not have an idea of where she was going to end up when I started.
That takes everything in the queue right now. Did you have another passage you wanted to read to us?
I would. Are we over time, or how are we doing?
No, we have this whole hour for overflow to keep talking to you, but we probably won't take the whole hour. So okay. I figure you can read one more. We might take a few more questions, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. I'm going to read. I'll read a section from this the new book. And for those of you who have read the Gilda Stories, you know that she in the chapter 2, she goes to Yerba Buena, which is the original name of San Francisco in the 1890s, and is learning from Sorrel and Anthony what it means to be a vampire. And while she's there, she falls in love with Eleanor, who was turned into a vampire by Sorrel. And he did it in a rash move, and he really shouldn't, because she wasn't a very nice person. So this is, and the thing about this next book, I think it's all going to be in the first person, since it's about her interior life. So this chapter is called "I Brought You Into This World." And that's an old saying. Probably a lot of parents may have said this to you. I brought you into this world, and I can take you out of it. I don't know if that's just a Black parent thing or what. But this chapter is called "I Brought You Into This World." And I'm going to try to skip around without being too bumpy. Samuel looked into his wife's deep brown eyes as he squeezed the life out of her, or at least he thought he did. I heard several versions of this story, but I wasn't sure how close to truth any of them came. I understood, though, that one beloved woman abused as a child, Eleanor, had grown up to seduce and manipulate others to be as destructive as the uncle who destroyed her childhood. Over the subsequent centuries, tales of abused children never ceased to wring my heart with a barbed pain that snatched breath away from me. All began to unravel one night in Eleanor's salon, where she held sway over the almost elite citizens of the still rustic Yerba Buena, and over me. The heat for gold continued to burn brightly. Some had found their fortunes and settled themselves in large homes on dusty streets leading to the bay in an effort to create opulence in the detritus of greed. Eleanor's family had been early in its luck in the northeastern hills, banking gold dust and tending their fortune. When her parents were killed in a wagon accident, her physical comfort was assured and managed by a cruel paternal uncle Her psychological and emotional health were much less so well cared for. I learned most of this from Anthony, partner to Sorrel. Unlike them, Eleanor was unwise in the long life bestowed on her. Soon it was to Samuel whom Eleanor turned, as she had with others, for her amusement in an effort to assuage the wounds that remained from her childhood. When Sorrel and Anthony tried to explain Eleanor's affliction, soullessness, I didn't understand or believe. Later, I came to realize that if she'd been employed on the stage to move marionettes about, telling tall tales and watching them bash each other like the infamous Punch and Judy, she'd have been world famous. However, it was humans she used, not dolls. This evening, I'd removed myself for a moment to tend to my bodily function in the delightfully appointed indoor facility, of which Eleanor was so proud. I was about to emerge from behind the dark green curtain, which perfectly matched Eleanor's eyes, when Samuel burst through the front door of the salon and marched toward Eleanor. Although I'd seen Samuel about town and once or twice in Sorrel's salon, we'd met formally only once. Eleanor introduced us at the opera, where the iciness of his greeting threatened my health. His wife, on the other hand, had been especially warm, particularly given my dark skin. I understood from Sorrel she was known to be an excellent designer of women's dresses, and I wondered if the golden gown she wore at that time was one of her own creations. Samuel was not uncommonly tall nor short, and quite fit. He stood before Eleanor tonight in the salon, no different except that all was slightly askew. "I've come to you a free man, my darling," he said in a low, tremulous whisper as he arrived at the small table where Eleanor sat. With our preternaturally acute hearing, it sounded almost as if he whispered in my ear as well as Eleanor's. He noted the table was set with places for two. "And I see you're expecting me." "No, I am not." Eleanor's voice was unmistakably unwelcoming. "Please leave my salon and make an appointment if you wish to see me in a future evening." From my place by the curtains, I could see rage pass over Samuel's face, and I thought to step out and be prepared to defend Eleanor. But I remembered that although she was of a diminutive size, she was of no small strength herself. Additionally, she had been the one to bring Samuel into our dark life, so he would not risk hurting his maker. I use the phrase dark life not to denote negativity. In fact, dark to me means rich like fertile soil, warm as were the faces of the family I lost to slavery, or unbounded like the night sky. I know so many, even in this unruly place of Yerba Buena, looked upon the darker races with scorn. Free Africans, Chinese railway workers, Mexican vaqueros were no more than paving stones on the white's path towards riches. I knew Samuel to be one of those who felt this way, so tried even harder to avoid his company. Abruptly towering over Eleanor, Samuel's expression shifted into supplication. "I did this for you, for us." It was then he looked around and noted the room with a dozen people at their own tables, some of whom were listening with varying degrees of discretion. That did not dampen his efforts to implore her for her attention. "She's dead. Finally, we're..." Is she? Or perhaps I should ask, who? Eleanor did not raise her eye from the glass which sparkled with effervescent wine that was gaining popularity in salons around the city. You know who. Does your wife have no name? She doesn't need a name now. Please cease your nattering and remove yourself, or I'll have you removed. You think you can dismiss me as if I were, Samuel, I'm not dismissing you. I'm simply asking you to observe civil behavior as any gentleman might and leave me to enjoy my company for the evening. At that, I stepped from the shadow of the drapery and faced Samuel. The hatred in his eyes was a fire he could not contain, but for the audience around us. Good evening, Samuel. I tried to employ the even musical notes that often served Eleanor so well, but after years of traveling alone on the road from New Orleans, my city manners were still rough-hewn. I feared my voice revealed under the syrup I had applied all of the anger inside of me. Ah, he barely glanced in my direction as his voice raised in pitch. You are interviewing for a new maid. I'm so sorry to interrupt. We'll talk another time. He turned and departed as if he had not just spoken of murder. I'm sorry for that. Samuel is impossible. Eleanor looked up at me with a smile which felt like sunshine, the sunshine that those of our nature could never fully enjoy. Ringlets of crimson curls caressed her handsome face as if she'd not a care in the world. He's famous for his fabulous nature. He'll say anything to get my attention. Even confess to murder? Don't be silly. Eleanor's voice was filled with sparkle as if it were a light bouncing on a rippling brook. But for the first time since we'd become close, I heard the hard stone beneath the surface. I knew then that inside that icy golden heart, she was planning to use me to separate Samuel from her and from his life. So that's the first chapter in the new book.
Sounds exciting. I think we're getting, there's some applause in the chat. We're getting towards the end, or we're getting towards the general need for everybody to take a break. So I wanted to ask you one final question because I cannot take life seriously even for a moment. Which animal would make the best president if they could rise up against us?
Wow, that's, I would say probably the owl, because owls are, they watch a lot, they listen really hard, they've got acute hearing, so they listen to everything, they watch a lot of things. They're, legendary to be wise. I'm taking that for granted. And they're predators. They do not mess around. When they got babies to feed, they find the smaller animal and bring them back to feed their babies. So I think we need all of those qualities in a president.
Owls for president. So, all right. Is there anything else you want to say to everybody?
No, I would like to say thank you, everyone here at Rainbow Space Magic, for inviting me and for having me have the time to talk with people. I really enjoy that. And if people have additional questions after, the convention is over, you can always go on my website and sign on and send me questions or thoughts. And I really, really appreciate being here. And next time, hopefully, we'll be in person.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming. We're just so honored to have you with us and for bringing BLF Press to us as well. We're honored to meet them.
Great.
And that is going to wrap this panel.